Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. If you're a yoga practitioner or teacher who knows that there's more to yoga than poses, but you're wondering where to find that, come join our quiet little party. Here you'll find resources to help you deepen your practice, as well as insightful conversations with yoga, movement, and meditation teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. So we talk about all things gentle yoga, meditation, yin, restorative, yoga therapy, mindfulness, and more. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Well, it's nice to be back recording a new podcast episode. I did not know that I was going to have to take a month-long hiatus, but here we are. If you're on my email list or following me on Instagram, you probably know this already, but I had to go help my mom in Alabama for 3 weeks, and it happened quite suddenly. My mom has terminal cancer that's affecting her central nervous system now, and it took a dramatic turn towards the beginning of August. So I had to go, and while I was there, she went through a severe cognitive decline over a matter of days, and that meant my sister and I had to figure out taking over all of my mom's affairs and her treatment decisions, and everything just started happening really fast. It's still a pretty fluid situation, and I know I'll have to be back there again at some point in the nearish future, but for now, I'm home. And I'm easing myself back into all of my projects and all of my teaching and everything that I want to tend to in my own life. And it's been a lot. It's been quite overwhelming at times. And as I've been sharing in my newsletter and Instagram and stuff, I've really been relying on my practice. The techniques that I know from mindfulness meditation and my favorite movement practices, but also just the perspective that they've given me, and sometimes the surprising amount of equanimity that's been available that I've developed over so many years of being a practitioner. That's been a bit of a silver lining in the last month. And I can tell you from personal experience that these practices work. There are still rough moments, of course, but the practices really will show up for you when you need them the most. And so today, I want to talk about some of the things that I include in my practice and kind of celebrate what I've learned from the different movement modalities that I absolutely love. And maybe it'll spark your interest to explore a new practice if something about my experience resonates with you. In particular, I'm going to talk about how I engage with 3 different movement modalities: yoga, somatics, and qigong, and what I think they each offer to the development of embodied mindfulness. Buddhist mindfulness meditation is kind of the big umbrella for me. It's the core framework of my practice. But each of these movement forms has taught me about different aspects of the embodied contemplative practice. So they've all become part of my path, and I thought I would talk a bit about how they all fit together. And before I go any further into this, I do want to note that we will be exploring each of these modalities in the upcoming Mindful Movement teacher training that I've designed. Starting in October, we'll be studying and practicing movement forms through the lens of mindfulness. In the training, we'll be exploring how you can take any movement form and use it as a vehicle for meditation. There are so many people out there, in my observation, who could benefit from learning mindfulness skills, but who feel like they can't meditate. I've found in my teaching that it's often much more effective to start with movement for so many people because it balances the nervous system and it helps people get out of their heads. It eases the body. And then you can weave in the meditative principles in a way that builds on the direct experience that they're having in movement. And with this intention, movement can make mindfulness so much more accessible. So if that sounds interesting to you, and if you're intrigued by the idea of sharing simple but really powerful mindful movement practices with others, check out the training at movedtomeditate.yoga/MMTT. We have some fantastic guest speakers too, most of whom have been previous guests on the podcast, and You might recognize some of them from that page, but they'll be sharing their expertise in gentle yoga, somatics, neuroscience, and community building, and more. Okay, so let's go into detail on the main modalities that I mentioned before. In my personal practice and teaching, I consistently work with mindfulness meditation, gentle and yin yoga, somatics, and qigong. I used to say my practice is eclectic because I tended to include so many different influences and practices that I enjoyed or found helpful. But I've come to reframe how I think about that. Rather than eclectic, I think of it more as being interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary to me implies more of a meaningful learning and dialogue across modalities. For me, this is not a random cherry picking of this and that practice without regard to the traditions, and it's not a short-term flirtation with whatever technique looks shiny at the moment, although there is often an element of experimenting with new ideas and being open. I'm offering my thoughts on the practices that I've had the most long-term relationship with. And I also think of my practice as interdisciplinary because I do my best to learn about the context that practices come from and to understand how and why they work. And I've come to understand more about how they fit together for me as I've engaged in a range of practices over a number of years. And without spending too much time on history and origins today, as important as it is, I just want to acknowledge that each of these modalities does have a rich and important cultural heritage, and that I am really grateful to be a beneficiary of these sources of wisdom that have primarily been developed in India, China, and other parts of Asia for many centuries. I think it's also important to say when I talk about the particular benefits of each of these practices in my overall mindful movement repertoire, this is not me claiming that these are the only valuable qualities or benefits of any of these practices, or that the individual modalities are incomplete in some way. Rather, I like to highlight what I've particularly learned from each and what I see as strengths that each of these bodies of practice contain, and why I might include them in a class or why I might offer them to my students as a tool for teaching a particular aspect of mindfulness. And then the last important piece of where I'm coming from here is that I'm looking at these modalities through a primary lens of mindfulness. How do these movement styles help me develop presence, help my students develop presence, embodiment, sustained attention, non-judgmental awareness, self-compassion, and insight? And of course, there are several different lenses you could use to analyze any of these practices and to organize your own engagement with different modalities based on what you value. That could be physical benefits like strength or mobility, or pain relief, or the social experience of being part of a certain practice community. And these are all valid, I think. But my interest is mainly in the contemplative point of view and how to develop mindfulness and meditative skills. So that's the lens that I'm looking through in this podcast episode. I'll start with talking about yoga because it was the very first movement modality that I encountered. And at the time, I was a very tense young person, a little stress ball, you might say. And I doubt that, and in fact, I know that, I doubt that I could really feel much that was going on in my body beyond the constricted, hard, contracted feeling of tension. In fact, I remember my first ever yoga session. It made such an impression on me because of how good it felt to sense my muscles lengthening into those first few yoga shapes and then softening and melting into Shavasana, which was the most profound experience of relaxation that I'd ever had. And looking back on it, I think a large part of what yoga did for me in those first few years was to melt enough tension so that I could even feel other sensations in my body and make a connection with my body. The postures and movements of yoga can really help wake up sensation where it feels like it's been dormant, or where you feel like the body has just kind of been asleep. As you stretch or put forth effort to move in a certain way, you make an intentional connection with the body. You start to feel what you're doing as you're doing it, which is an experience of embodiment in the present moment. And of course, working with the breath and slowing down the movements and releasing tension. This all affects the nervous system too. So we become much more receptive to stillness, much more able to just be, which very much supports meditation. And I also find that yoga helped me to really name and differentiate between different types of sensations, like the sensations of stretch or effort, or the feeling of release versus tension versus pain, or pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations. Then physical sensations versus emotional feelings, being able to map and differentiate and name these things. I've also found that yoga postures really help us to observe how we relate to intensity. I find this especially in teaching yin yoga. Like, do we tend to crave intensity and follow after intensity? Do we define our worth or the worth of our practice through intensity? Do we shy away from it? Do we get overwhelmed easily? So those are a few questions we could make a whole episode about. We could dig into further, but there are a few elements of what I think yoga can really bring to the table for your mindfulness practice because of the really dynamic way that it works with the body and because of the availability of sensation and action within the postural yoga practices. And that works within the container of the full yogic repertoire of breath and meditation and philosophical and ethical practices too, which are really vast. So then what about the modality of somatics? Why might we fold in this discipline alongside the embodiment benefits of yoga that I've just named, which are a lot? Well, for me, somatics really offers a unique focus on subtlety. I really enjoy somatic exercises like those from Hanna Somatics or Feldenkrais, for example, because they give me the opportunity to really slow things down, really zoom in, and attune to sensations and movements that are very easy to overlook. You can get really interested in these tiny micro movements and start to feel how incredibly significant they are. How a tiny little gesture is often the building block of something more complex, whether that's a movement you want to be able to do or a tension pattern that you want to unwind. Somatic exercises help us to see connections within the body. And because they often work through methods of gently engaging or contracting specific areas, and then deliberately and thoroughly melting that engagement, doing these kind of contract, relax patterns, they help us understand cycles of unconscious contraction and conscious release and how we might work with that with more awareness. This process of letting go and softening. And it gives us some framework around that. And it can also be very calming and down-regulating for the nervous system to do these kind of really slow and subtle, granular kinds of relaxation practices. It really slows us down and can very much untangle or reprogram, you might say, some of the habitual holding patterns that we have on a very profound level. And somatic exercise can be its own distinct movement practice, or it can easily be folded into other yoga Pilates or mindful movement type sessions. I often use somatic movements as part of the quote warm-up phase of a yoga class, alongside perhaps other gentle yoga movements, as a way of connecting to a specific part of the body or preparing the foundational gestures that will culminate in a more complex yoga pose. So it can really work alongside of yoga. I think a lot of times if I don't name it as this is a somatic exercise, people just assume it's a yoga pose. But I also use a lot of somatics in yoga therapy too when I'm working with people, because the movements can start very small and be a really non-threatening way to explore when, working with someone who's dealing with a lot of pain or change in their body. And this subtle way of working with the body in somatics really helps refine our attention and helps us to learn how to sustain our awareness on things that are quieter and less dramatic. We learn to see more deeply, more clearly, just more of what's going on. And that's a huge deal for mindfulness practice. So lastly, let's talk a little bit about qigong. Qigong has been the most recent addition to my consistent rotation of practices, but it has become hugely important to me over the last few years. I was introduced to it originally on meditation retreats as a form of moving mindfulness, but it didn't totally click for me at first. It was, just less of a sensation-oriented practice than yoga and more of a movement-oriented practice than somatics. So it took me a while to get it and to understand what to do with it. But eventually it really got to me in some ways that other modalities hadn't. For one thing, I've come to appreciate the way that qigong moves energy, especially emotional energy, and how that affects my nervous system. I use a lot of clearing practices from qigong that help me process, make space for, and or disperse energy and emotional charge. I did a lot of this on my trip recently to Alabama. I don't think I would have been able to sleep at night if I didn't stand there in the bedroom and do 10 or 15 minutes of this kind of energy clearing and nervous system balancing. And I think a lot of us use different kinds of exercise and movement for discharging things like anxiety or anger, whether it looks like going for a run or lifting weights or doing sun salutations or whatever. But qigong really addresses that quite explicitly as a very built-in part of the practice. It's very deliberate and very proactive in the qigong practice. And this might look like doing shaking exercises or tapping exercises or certain patterns of breathing combined with gestures that you do with the intention of clearing space around or within yourself, or to create qi flow where there's been stuckness. That's kind of hard to describe in this abstract way, without showing you. But if you try a little bit of qigong, you might start to understand what I mean. And if you're a yin yoga practitioner, you would recognize some of the theory of this that revolves around the energetic meridian system as well. When we are in relationship with the nervous system and emotions in this way, this kind of proactive way, it's kind of like practicing nervous system hygiene and taking care of the buildup in the system. And that is an incredible contribution to our mindfulness practice. Doing some clearing practices before meditation can reduce restlessness and monkey mind, for example, so that we can actually settle in a natural and unforced way when we sit down to meditate. And no, disclaimer, that's not about getting rid of emotions or avoiding the process of being with them in meditation, which is very much part of the mindfulness practice. This is more like giving yourself some space and some nervous system regulation that gives a better container in which you can be present with your experience, if that makes sense. And then you have the really graceful qigong flows as well, that part of the qigong practice, which can also be an amazing place to simply learn how to drop in to effortless movement. Because these flows are simple and they tend to not be too strenuous, and there's repetition. They're repeated patterns that we do for for a few minutes. To me, that means there's less to get hung up on. There's less kind of detail and instruction and constantly changing what we're doing and moving from this to that. So you can just let go into the simple flow of movement. And it's accessible. It's something usually that most people could physically do. And it starts to feel like less of me doing this thing, me figuring it out, doing it right, and more of a sense of being within the movement. And sometimes even a sense of just being moved by the qi, or a kind of mysterious experience of non-doing in motion. And it's just very refreshing and very interesting to really have that experience of dropping in and almost feeling like the movement is doing itself. So it's very much meditation in motion, and accessible, I think, in some ways that other practices may not be. Many people, I think, have this sense of flow sometimes in doing a yoga practice, but that might take quite a bit of physical ability and probably years of experience to really be able to drop in the same way that I think is quite accessible in these simple qigong flows. So to me, understanding these different gifts that the practices offer, it helps me to choose what tool I might need on a given day, or how I might put some of these elements from multiple modalities together to design a mindful movement class sequence that's really effective for the particular student or students that I'm working with. And it's really wonderful to live in a time when we have access to all of these different movement traditions. If you do some exploring, you'll likely find that many of the strengths and skills are transferable. Something you learn in somatics or qigong could transfer over to your yoga practice and help you experience the potential of yoga in a deeper way, just for example. And transferable skills is really a lot of what this topic is about for me. For one thing, all of these movement practices can be used to unlock mindfulness skills, which can be applied in meditation, which can be applied in daily life. Another thing is that people respond to different styles of practice differently. So it's very good that there are multiple doorways to walk through for people interested in exploring a mindful path. So I hope this conversation has been interesting for you, and I know I enjoy breaking things down to clarify what I'm learning from different sources. But if you're curious to hear more about somatics in particular, or qigong in particular, there are a few podcast episodes that I've done here with different guest experts specifically about those modalities. So be sure to check those out and search on my website on the podcast page to find all the different links to previous episodes. And if you are ready for a fuller exploration of how to teach mindfulness through a variety of movement genres, do take a look at the Mindful Movement Teacher Training that I'm leading this fall and winter. I am so excited to offer this unique and practical program that's all about leading movement practices that center mindfulness, so that your students can learn to be more present for what matters to them. The info is at movedtomeditate.yoga/MMTT, and you can also contact me with any questions. As always, I really appreciate you being here, and I'm very open to your comments and thoughts about these topics. So feel free to be in touch, and until next time, let your practice be expansive, open, and deep. Thanks for listening. So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend and/or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find us that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, live online classes, teacher trainings, and private lessons, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. Thanks so much for listening.